Now, the youngsters amongst us who are in various parts of the building mostly have been enjoying half-term this particular week, haven't they? Along with some teachers and some parents as well. We've been enjoying the good weather that we've had. Well, I can remember when I was a kid, and sorry, I'm just going to reminisce for a moment. We used to spend a lot of our time during the school holidays and on Saturdays and weekends making dens in the woods near to where I used to live down in North Kent. And me and my mates, we used to get anything that we could lay our hands on to make these particular camps. Well, one day I found this little bit of old carpet that was laying there in the woods next to a tree, and I thought to myself, hey up, that could come in very handy indeed for a bit of flooring or something like that. And so I picked it up, not realizing that it already had some wasps in it. These wasps had made it their home, and they were not best pleased that I had come to take it away from them. So much so that they chased me right out of the woods, and I didn't stop running until I reached my home. They were well and truly upset. Well, last week, as we saw at the start of chapter 13, Saul and his son Jonathan, they were getting into a bit of a scrap, weren't they? And Jonathan had gone and attacked a Philistine outpost, which had riled up the Philistines no end. So much so that they were now swarming, ready for a fight with the Israelites. And realizing that they were completely outnumbered, many of those Israelites, they had begun running for the hills. They had crossed the River Jordan, and they have found all sorts of different places to hide, behind rocks and in cisterns and all sorts of places. They were scared stiff. As we see in verse 15 of chapter 13, out of an army of 3,000, Saul had already whittled it down to that, Saul was now left with just 600 men who, incidentally, were also quaking in their boots. What's more, as we also heard last week, under great pressure himself, Saul had also panicked, he disobeyed God, and he'd offered that burnt offering rather than waiting for the priest Samuel to arrive to administer it. And that single act of disobedience, with that, Saul was told that his kingdom would not last, that his reign would end, and that the Lord would find someone else to rule over the nation, a man after his own heart. But as we see from verse 16, for now, Saul remains in charge. We're told there that Saul and his son Jonathan and the men with them were staying at Gibeah of Benjamin. And the Philistines were now camped at Michmash, which, if you remember again from last week, was exactly the same place that the Israelites had been camped before. And so this was really a case of losing ground to the enemy. Not only that, but as you'll see from verse 17, the enemy is now sending out raiding parties, covert special forces to the north and to the west and to the east in order to gain even more ground, rampaging and pillaging as they go. The situation is desperate. The Israelites, they're in real trouble. They are totally outnumbered and also completely outgunned too. Just take a look at verse 19. It's going to appear on the screen as well. We're told there, not a blacksmith could be found in the whole of the land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plowshares, mattocks, axes and sickles sharpened. The price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening plowshares and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes and for repointing goads. So on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or a spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. Rather cleverly, the Philistines, they had established a bit of a monopoly on all of the technology that was needed to make and mend iron. And so they were able to restrict Israel's ability to make any weapons. So much so that, as we see in this passage, there were only 2 swords in the whole of Israel. Saul had one, and his son Jonathan had the other. With the Philistines and their cutting-edge technology, with their superior weaponry, not to mention their vast army, On the surface of things, this is a completely unfair fight, isn't it? An absolutely hopeless situation. So what happens next? Well, as we're about to see, there is a real contrast in how these two main characters in this particular account react under such mounting pressure. Here we see the difference between Saul's inactivity on the one hand and Jonathan's faith on the other. So first of all, where is Saul as this whole episode unfolds? Well, chapter 14, verse 2 tells us that Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. That sounds rather nice, doesn't it? Like some kind of posh coffee shop. Saul was sitting under the pomegranate tree in Migron, relaxing with his troops, sipping his cappuccino, not willing to take on the Philistines, perhaps content with the status quo. You know, the picture of Saul here is a sorry picture, isn't it? Of the kind of king that Israel had wanted to lead them out into battle against their enemies. That's the kind of king they had hoped for. But that's not the kind of king they had got. And just who is sitting there with him? Well, we're told, aren't we, in verse 2, that there are 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. He was the son of Ichabod's brother Atub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh. Now, for those of us who have been following this series in 1 Samuel, or perhaps you've read this particular book before, alarm bells should be ringing in our ears at this point. Because these guys, they're not good news. You might remember that Phinehas and Hophni were Eli's two sons. And they are described for us in 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 12 as scoundrels who had no regard for the Lord. As for this guy Ichabod, well, his name literally meant the glory of God had departed. So this is an interesting group that Saul has gathered around him. And it's true, isn't it? Birds of a feather flock together. And therein lies a lesson for us too. Because, you know, the people that we draw around ourselves, those people that we're friends with, those people we choose to hang out with, those we allow to influence us, whether on social media or physically, it says a huge amount about who we are as individuals. If we draw around ourselves those who are discontented and never satisfied, people who are always complaining and fearful and critical in their views, then we are likely to become that way too. And so perhaps it's not too much of a surprise that Saul is found with these kind of characters around him, given where he is at this moment in time, with the departing of Saul's kingdom being somehow linked to the departing of God's glory, Ichabod. Saul's there and he's sitting under this pomegranate tree. Whereas in contrast, his son Jonathan is hatching a plan to go and make something happen. Verse 1 of chapter 14 tells us that one day Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he did not tell his father. While Saul stays out of the sun and safely out of reach of the enemy, his son Jonathan is about to take on some more Philistines. Jonathan's a man of action. And what's more, he doesn't tell his father what he's up to either. Why? Well, because I think he knows exactly what his father's reaction is going to be. Saul doesn't want to go and cause trouble with the Philistines, whereas Jonathan no longer wants Israel to be troubled by them. Saul is content to play defense, whereas Jonathan, he wants to go out on the offense. Saul sits, Jonathan acts. Again, the contrast that we're given here is stark, isn't it, between these two? And so Jonathan, he sets out secretly, accompanied by his armor-bearer. "Come," Jonathan says in verse 6, "let's go over to the outposts of those uncircumcised fellows, those ungodly folk. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf." That's a wonderful word, isn't it? The word perhaps. I think that sometimes when it comes to stepping out in faith ourselves, we can often be reluctant to do so because we're not completely sure of the way that things are going to turn out. We're not sure that they'll turn out the way that we want them to, or the way that we had planned. Well, Jonathan, he is willing to trust God whatever the outcome. And in saying that, he doesn't presume anything either. He's a realist. He realizes that the Lord may well choose to act, or he may not. But that's entirely up to him. You remember that Daniel and his 3 friends displayed that same kind of faith when they were there in that fiery furnace, when they said to King Nebuchadnezzar, the God we serve is able to deliver us. But even if he does not, we will not serve your gods and worship the image of gold you have set up. And then when you turn over to the New Testament, Jesus displayed the same kind of attitude, didn't he? There in the Garden of Gethsemane, when kneeling down there to pray on the way to the cross, Jesus says, Father, take this cup from me. And then he adds, but not my will, but yours be done. Like Jesus and Daniel before him, Jonathan, he doesn't make any demands of God. He doesn't tell God what he has to do. Perhaps he will act, perhaps he won't. But one thing Jonathan is certain of is that God can act if he chooses to. As Jonathan continues, and here comes the certainty, nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. The one thing Jonathan is absolutely sure of is that the Lord can act. He can save if he chooses to. And he can do that with lots of people or with just a few, with just 1 or 2. The point is that the number of people there are, the amount of resources available, isn't a barrier to God achieving his will. Nothing can hinder him. God may or he may not choose to save. That's completely up to him. Perhaps he will, perhaps he won't. But what we can be absolutely sure of, what we can bank our life on, is that God is capable and able to save souls. Of that there is no doubt. And Jonathan, he understood this. And again, we see a contrast, don't we, between Jonathan and his father Saul in their view of the Lord, in their theology. Then notice for a moment as we move on the armor bearer and his loyalty. Verse 7 says this, do all that you have in mind, his armor bearer said. Go ahead, I am with you, heart and soul. Now the armor bearer's role was a very important one, but it was also a very dangerous one as well. Because in committing himself to the leader, he was committing himself to whatever would transpire, whether that be to victory or to defeat. He was quite literally putting his life on the line with this fellow that he was following. And looking at this particular situation, to the casual observer at least, it seems like utter madness, doesn't it? 2 men, 1 sword, taking on the might of the Philistine army who are armed to the teeth with these iron weapons. But I think it's a reminder to us again of who we gather around us, isn't it? Especially when it comes to leadership. No man is an island. What if the Apostle Paul hadn't had those others around him? The Apostle Paul had many ministry associates, didn't he? What if he hadn't had those people around him, like Barnabas? What if Moses hadn't had his brother Aaron with him, his mouthpiece? What a blessing it is to have those around us who will not only challenge us when we need to be rightly challenged, but will also support and encourage us, who, unlike those that Saul had gathered around him, display the same faith and confidence in the same Lord, and are willing to say, go ahead, I am with you, heart and soul. So with his armor bearers backing, Jonathan, he hatches this plan. Verse 8. Jonathan said, come on then, we will cross over towards them and let them see us. If they say to us, wait there until we come to you, we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands. So they go and show themselves to this Philistine outpost, come out into the open. And the Philistines, cocky and confident as they are, they tell them to come on up. Not come on down. No, this isn't a game show. Come on up. Let's be having you, we might say in Norfolk. I think you have to be a Norwich City fan to appreciate that. We rejoin the passage again in the middle of verse 12. So Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, climb up with me, after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. Which is another wonderful trait, isn't it? That word after. Climb up after me, Jonathan says. I'll go first, you follow on. I wonder how many of us would have been tempted and inclined to say the opposite. How many of us would have said something like, no, you go on ahead, I'll be right behind you. I know I'd be tempted to say that. Or here's a great idea. How about you put it forward at the next meeting? Sometimes it's tempting, isn't it, to delegate our authority to others around us, to abdicate our responsibility altogether, whether that be at home or at work, in the church, or in our own personal Christian lives, when it comes to a personal battle with sin, perhaps. It's tempting to pass on that responsibility to take action on a particular issue, and it's tempting to pass it on to an armor bearer, onto someone else. It's tempting to kind of make excuses for ourselves when we should be the ones who are taking the lead on this, as Jonathan does here. No, I'm going to take responsibility, Jonathan says. I'm going to be the trailblazer. I'm going to be the one to stick my neck out and trust in the Lord and go first on this one. And so Jonathan, sword in hand with his armor bearer in tow, completely vulnerable to the enemy who are high above them there on the hillside, climb up this treacherous terrain, this cliff edge, using their hands and their feet, which again renders them totally useless, defenseless and useless to an attack. And when they reach the top of this ridge, they then set about attacking the Philistines. And we're told in verse 14 that Jonathan and the armor bearer killed some 20 men in the area of about half an acre. What an incredible battle that must have been. What a movie scene that would make. The Battle of Michmash Pass, it might be called. And a very one-sided battle too, as it turns out. I suppose it might be tempting, having said what we've said, to think at this point that Jonathan is the real hero in this story. That where Saul failed, Jonathan, he showed faith. Where Saul stood still, Jonathan, he moved forwards. And whilst Jonathan is clearly a very good example of someone who shows great courage and faith in the midst of some real adverse and challenging situations, whilst we should all desire to be a little bit more like Jonathan is, the real hero in all of this is someone altogether different. In Jonathan, we are given a glimpse, aren't we, of the kind of leader that we all need. I like to think of Jonathan as one of those who is celebrated there in Hebrews 11, in that great, not that great hall of fame, but that great hall of faith. As one of those faithful witnesses there in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, who is there cheering us on, but is really a signpost pointing to someone who is far greater than himself. Who is the real hero in all of this? We'll just take a look at the very next verse, verse 15. Verse 15 tells us that as a result of this skirmish, panic struck the whole army. There we read, panic struck the whole army. those in the camp and field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties. And the ground shook. It was a panic sent by who? By God, yeah. You see, the Lord, he is the real hero in all of this. You'll know if you've read your Bible that whenever we hear of the ground shaking in Scripture, of an earthquake happening, it's a sign that God is at work. You recall that there was an earthquake, wasn't there, when Jesus died and rose again. And there was an earthquake when Paul and Silas were there in prison, singing. And then the doors suddenly flung wide open. And the Philippian jailer cried out, "What must I do to be saved?" What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that the Lord is not some remote bystander in our world, but is very much involved. And the Lord is not some remote bystander in our own lives either. When the ground shakes, when trouble comes our way, when confusion reigns, those events in our lives, they don't catch him by surprise. He's all too aware of them. The question for us is, when the ground shakes, where and to whom will we turn? You know, the Philistines, they panicked, didn't they? They scattered in each and every direction. They didn't know which way to turn. Their false god Dagon, he wasn't any use to them now. Yes, Jonathan and the armor bearer, they attacked in faith. But as we see, it's the Lord who gives the ultimate victory. And we need to bear that in mind in our own lives too, don't we? That it's the Lord who deserves all of the praise for those little victories and successes that we might have along the way. And we need to give him his rightful praise. Meanwhile, back at the pomegranate tree, Saul, he's informed, isn't he, of what's happening. That the Philistine forces are deserting their stations and running away. And so what does he do? Does he now spring into action? Well, no, verse 17 tells us that first of all, Saul has a roll call. He counts his troops to see who's there and who's not, which is something that he seems to quite enjoy doing, isn't it? As we saw back in verse 15 of the last chapter. It's like he's saying, well, I am king. I know that I should be doing something around here, and so let's just have a bit of a count up. The trouble is that there are times in life when you've got to stop counting and start moving. And yet in Saul's case, the dithering continues. Having discovered that his son Jonathan has gone AWOL, Saul asked for the Ark of the Covenant, to be brought to him, presumably so that he can seek God's help on this particular matter. But then he sends it away as quickly as it's arrived. As someone has put it, Saul prays when he should act and acts when he should pray. Which again kind of makes you glad that the Lord is in charge and that the battle is ultimately his. But eventually, as we see, spurred on by the Lord's intervention and Jonathan's faith, the rest of the Israelites, they join in the fight. Even those who had previously run away and hidden in those hills, they come out as they pursue the Philistines and drive them beyond Bethaven. And verse 23 ends with these words, doesn't it? On that day, the Lord saved Israel. Again, it's the Lord who saves. So what are we to make of all of this? Well, hopefully as we've gone through this passage this morning, we've learned some lessons along the way. But what is the main application for us to take away today from these verses? Well, in the face of insurmountable odds, in the face of seemingly impossible situations, we see two very different reactions, don't we? Saul, who in fear and relying on his own abilities, stood still, and Jonathan, who trusting in the Lord, moved forward in faith. Now today, of course, we're not facing the might of a physical Philistine army, are we? But as Christians, we are engaged in a battle, in a spiritual battle, and there are real physical lives at stake. People around us People who are driving along the outer ring road right now. People who we perhaps live with and work with. Our neighbours and our friends. People who we meet on a daily basis. People around us who are heading to a lost eternity. People who need to hear the good news of the gospel. That Jesus Christ is more than able to save and help us. And the challenge for us is the mission, should we choose to accept it, is will we stay put in fear with that message? Will we hold on to it? Or will we choose to move out and share it in faith? This week at our vision night, we will be discussing what it might look like for us to do that as a church. What it might look like for us to take a fresh step of faith. And for some of us, that might be quite unsettling. We might prefer, as Saul did, to play it safe, not to make any waves with those around us, not to change anything around here, not to make any advances, but to keep the status quo, to keep peace, to remain sitting under that proverbial pomegranate tree. But I keep asking myself as I read this account, what would have happened if Jonathan had done that? What would have happened if Jonathan had listened to his faithless dad? What would have happened if he had gone with that fearful crowd, all 600 plus of them? What if he had stayed put there in Magron, under that pomegranate tree, and not trusted the Lord? Well, we don't know, do we? Because we're not told. But perhaps, there's that word again, perhaps Jonathan wouldn't have had his faith stretched and his relationship with the Lord deepened and enriched. Perhaps the Israelites wouldn't have experienced the joy of seeing God at work, an enemy on the run, and the battle advancing. Perhaps the Israelites themselves would have ended up being defeated. Who knows? But one thing's for certain. If we live in fear and we don't step out in faith, we will never know what the Lord can do. I believe that's a challenge for us today. Will we live in fear or will we step out in faith?